Have you ever heard of a man who fell in love with a woman before he even knew what she looked like? And then, the day she set foot in the barren West, he fell off a cliff in an accident no one dared to talk about, leaving behind a ranch shrouded in secrets and painful silence. Clara arrives with a broken heart, only to find herself caught between two choices: run away from a wounded land, or stay to heal a man who has never held her hand, but has loved her since before she was born. If it were you, would you have the courage to step into a love that has never been seen, but is truer than any promise? Would you dare to open your heart when you know that behind that gentleness are wounds that can drag you into a dangerous spiral? This story is not just for listening, it is for remembering yourself. At some point, when your heart was faced with a difficult choice. Please join us on this healing journey. Please like, share, and subscribe so we can get started together. The wind blew fiercely across the Red Creek station, carrying the smell of dry dirt and the chill from the Wind River Mountains. The silver-gray train stopped with a long, squealing screech, then sank into the vast silence of the Wild West. Passengers hurried off, coats rustling, boots crunching on the dry wood, and then scattered from the station in groups like dry leaves blown by the wind. Amidst it all, Clara Ellington stood alone. She placed her gloved hands on the worn leather suitcase, the only thing left after 2 long years of gathering and organizing her life, which had fallen apart since her husband's death. At 42, Clara was no longer the dreamy girl she had always been. The loss had shaped her into a quiet woman, one who observed more than she spoke, who sighed to herself rather than to others. A gust of wind blew, blowing her thin scarf to one side. Clara held it, her eyes slowly looking around the small station in Red Creek, Wyoming territory, the place she had chosen as her final gamble. She clutched the letter in her hand. The last letter from Jonas Whitlock, the man she had never met. The cowboy from the West looking for a woman to share the old family home with. The one whose words had made Clara feel a warm fire kindled in a heart that had long been dark. He wrote, "If you arrive and I haven't come to the station to pick you up yet, don't worry. I'll always be waiting for you here, under this vast sky." Clara carefully folded the letter, but as time went on, the silence on the platform became more and more unusual. All the passengers had left. The porter had left. Even the ticket inspector had gone into the station to prepare for the next train. Only she left, a middle-aged woman standing in the cold, windy west, with no one to pick her up. The old feeling, the feeling of abandonment, rose again, like a cold wave. Clara tried to keep her breathing steady, tried to stop herself from thinking about that rainy afternoon 2 years ago in Charleston, when she had stood by the hospital bed and known that her only companion would never open his eyes again. "Don't be weak, Clara," she whispered. "He told me that before he died." She adjusted her wide-brimmed hat and looked around again, but no one came toward her. None of the faces were familiar from the old photos Jonas had sent, until a deep voice rang out behind him. "Are you Mrs. Clara Ellington?" Clara turned back. A tall man with silver-gray hair and a leather jacket that smelled of gunpowder and wind stood a few steps away from her. He wore an old, sun-faded cowboy hat, and his eyes were deep and serious. Sheriff Nolan Briggs. Clara recognized him immediately because Jonas had mentioned him in a letter, but his face today was not what she had imagined. It was dark, mixed with confusion and pity. Clara nodded slightly. "Yes, I am Clara Ellington." Sheriff Briggs took off his hat, stood up straight, and spoke slowly, as if every word weighed heavily on his heart. "I'm afraid I have bad news. Jonas can't come to pick you up today." A long silence. Clara gripped the suitcase handle tighter. What's wrong?" Sheriff took a deep breath. 3 days ago, Jonas's horses panicked during a thunderstorm. Jonas tried to calm the situation, but he was thrown from the fence and hit a stall post. Clara's heart clenched. "Is he alive?" Sheriff nodded. "Yes, but he is still unconscious. The doctor does not dare say anything for sure." A strong gust of wind blew past, blowing Clara's scarf behind her, but she no longer paid attention. All sounds seemed to be drawn away from her ears, leaving only a single question. Am I late? Or is fate playing tricks on me? Sheriff Briggs continued, his voice low. Jonas told me, if anything happens before you arrive, take you back to Whitlock Farm. Don't leave you standing alone at the station. Clara closed her eyes for a moment. She wondered how someone she had never met could think so far ahead. The thoughtfulness made her heart ache rather than lighten it. What should I do? Sir Clara asked, her voice trembling slightly but trying to keep calm. Sheriff looked straight at her, his eyes sharp but sincere. There are 2 ways for you, Mrs. Ellington. One is to take the next train back east. The other is to come with me to the ranch and wait for Jonas to wake up. Clara watched the ship in the distance steam rising in the afternoon sun, like a safe escape, a road she knew, though empty and lonely. Then she turned to look out at the rolling mountains on the horizon, where Whitlock Farm sat in the vast, wild, open space. Do you want to go back? Sheriff asked softly. Clara swallowed the bitterness that was rising in her throat. She remembered what Jonas had written. The West is sometimes so lonely that people think they have disappeared from the world. But sometimes it is that silence that helps people find themselves. And for some reason, those words seemed to push Clara forward, even though she knew the path was uncertain. No, Clara whispered. I will go with you. Sheriff Briggs nodded, putting his old cowboy hat back on. Well then, welcome to Red Creek, Mrs. Ellington. Clara took a deep breath. The western air was crisp but full of life. She followed Sheriff, carrying her small suitcase, and her heart was both trembling and brave. She didn't know what awaited her, didn't know if Jonas would wake up, didn't know if she was walking into happiness or into new pain. But for the first time in years, Clara felt like she was choosing, not running away. And sometimes, just that is enough to change a life. The road to Whitlock Farm stretched across vast slopes, where the wind blew dust into misty clouds like the breath of the wilderness. Clara sat in Sheriff Briggs's carriage, clutching her suitcase and the folded letter. The wheels made a heavy clatter on the rough road, and she felt as if she were entering a new world, not with her feet but with her heart pounding. A moment later, the large wooden roof of Whitlock Ranch appeared in the distance. It was not a grand or luxurious house, but it had the solidity of a house built with the perseverance of many generations. The ranch gate was made of rough pine, and above it hung a simple but family-marked sign, Whitlock Ranch. As the carriage pulled into the front yard, Clara saw a man standing by the stables. He was tall, with dark hair tinged with gray, and his face was strong but tired. He wore a thick coat and dark leather pants like many Western cowboys. His eyes were sharp and cautious. That's Ethan Whitlock, Jonas's younger brother. Ethan looked at Clara with an unreadable gaze. There was no warm welcome, no friendly smile. Just a silent observation, as if he was trying to gauge whether the woman before him was a troublemaker. Sheriff Briggs stepped out first, nodding slightly at Ethan as he approached. Ethan approached slowly, his boots clicking heavily on the ground. Clara stood still beside the car, feeling her legs tremble slightly as Ethan stopped in front of her. He did not offer his hand. He only asked in a low, hoarse voice, like dry earth after winter. "Are you Clara Ellington?" Clara nodded. "I'm Ethan Whitlock. Jonas is my brother." There was a brief silence. Ethan kept his eyes on Clara, as if trying to figure out what kind of person he was. The way he looked at her made Clara tighten her grip on her suitcase. Still, she remained calm. She had been through too much to be afraid of a stranger's gaze. Sheriff Briggs explained the situation to Ethan in a soft voice. Clara noticed that Ethan's eyelids fluttered slightly when he mentioned Jonas's injury, though his face remained calm. There was something deep in his eyes, a hidden worry, as if he were used to burying his emotions in silence. It wasn't until Briggs said Jonas wasn't fully conscious that Clara heard Ethan let out a small breath. Not hard, not clear, just a gasp, like someone trying to keep himself upright. Ethan turned back to look at Clara. His voice was still even. "Jonas mentioned her in a few of his letters, but I didn't think she'd come now. I don't mean to be offensive, but it complicates things." Clara felt the coldness in those words, but she maintained her characteristic calm. I understand. I don't want to bother anyone either. If it doesn't suit me, I can leave when Mr. Briggs takes me back to town. Ethan was silent for a long time. Clara saw the hesitation flicker in his eyes, then disappear. Finally, he shook his head. Jonas wasn't one to abandon anyone in need. If he'd called her here, at least she had a place in the house. You could stay? I had a spare room in the back. Sheriff Briggs touched Ethan's shoulder lightly, as if to remind him to be kinder. But Ethan stood there, his expression unchanged. Clara could sense a thick layer of defense in him, a kind of invisible barrier built up after years of living with his own private feelings, not easily open to anyone. Clara followed Ethan into the large wooden house. As the door opened, the smell of old pine mixed with the warmth of the fireplace filled the air. The house was not luxuriously furnished, but every object showed the hand of those who lived here, accustomed to hard work and simple living. Ethan led Clara through the living room to a small room off the back hallway. He opened the door for her, then stood aside. You rest here for now. Jonah is in the room across the street, but the doctor said there should be only one person. I'll take care of him. Ask if you need anything. The ranch isn't very big. You'll get used to it. Clara looked around the room. A single wooden bed, a small dresser, a window overlooking the empty lot behind the house. The room was simple, but warm and clean. She turned to Ethan, about to thank him, but Ethan had already turned away. His words echoed in her head. I didn't think she would come at this time. Not blaming, but clearly defensive. Clara understood. Westerners don't open up easily, especially to women who appear suddenly in the middle of a family crisis. She watched Ethan walk down the hallway, his steps heavy and sure, like someone used to taking responsibility for others. Clara put her suitcase down on the bed and stood by the window, looking out at the back lot. The wooden railings ran toward the stables, where a rhythmic clop-clop echoed. The scene was both cold and gentle, just like Ethan. In that moment, Clara suddenly understood that she had just entered the life of people who did not like to talk much, a land where silence had more weight than words, a land where feelings were kept in looks and actions, not promises or oaths. And it was that silence that made Clara's heart suddenly feel heavy, but also strangely peaceful, as if she had found where she needed to stand, even though the road ahead was still uncertain. Outside the window, the wind blew through the distant pine trees. Clara's voice turned soft. I'm here. I'm really here. In the quiet of Whitlock Ranch. She felt something change, silently but unstoppably. A new beginning, both fragile and powerful, like the first breath after long years of suffering. She closed her eyes, her heart beat slowly but steadily. She knew life here would not be easy, but for the first time in years, Clara did not feel alone. No more running from loss. She was stepping into something else, something that would change everything. The small room Ethan had given Clara had a window that looked out onto a dry field that stretched out like an earth-colored carpet. When Clara opened the window, the air of this land rushed in, carrying the scent of young pines and the lingering moisture of the mountain winds. Everything was unfamiliar, but there was something about it that made her feel a calm, like the slow breathing of a land that had lived too long with wind and loneliness. Clara took her time arranging her things. There wasn't much to display, but she was meticulous. The brown wool scarf she'd brought from Charleston hung next to her bed. A small notebook sat on her desk. Each object reminded her of the long journey she'd taken to get here. As Clara stepped out into the hallway, she heard heavy footsteps somewhere in the house. She followed the sound and stopped at a half-open door. Inside, Jonas lay on a large wooden bed, his face pale, bruises still visible on his temples and under his jaw. A figure was bending over, placing a warm towel on his forehead. It was Ethan. Clara stood still for a moment, not wanting to disturb her. Ethan hadn't noticed her yet. He did everything with the strange patience of someone used to caring for others, but never voicing his concerns. Every movement was careful, as if Jonas were something fragile. Finally, Ethan turned, his eyes met Clara's. In that moment, the wariness was there again, But this time it was mixed with something more complicated. Maybe embarrassment at being caught off guard. Maybe a sense of unease around the woman Jonas had hoped to trust. Clara nodded slightly in greeting and stepped back from Jonas's door, leaving Ethan room to continue his work. She went down to the kitchen, searching the wooden cabinets for the utensils to prepare the meal. The Whitlock's kitchen was kept neat and simple in true Western style. The furniture was mostly old iron. The white china dishes had a few small cracks. Clara lit the stove, the heat spreading gently. She wasn't much of a cook for a crowd, but years of living alone had taught her how to manage. As she stirred the soup, footsteps stopped behind her. Ethan entered, his sleeves still stained with dirt from outside. He stood by the table, saying nothing for a few seconds. Clara understood this was one of those Western silences they would speak if necessary, but otherwise, their presence was enough. She asked in a soft, unperturbed voice, "Would you like something?" Ethan hesitated, then nodded. He sat in the wooden chair beside the table. The firelight reflected off the tabletop, casting a quiet golden glow that illuminated the fatigue in his eyes. Clara placed a bowl of soup in front of him, a light aroma wafting through the kitchen. Ethan took a few spoonfuls and spoke, his voice low and slow. "I've been so busy since Jonas fell that I haven't had a proper meal. Thanks." Clara smiled slightly. "I just do what I can. I don't want to be a burden." Ethan put down his spoon, his eyes following Clara thoughtfully. No one in this house has ever been considered a burden, but people in Red Creek have a habit of looking at strangers with a critical eye. "Don't worry if you hear anything unpleasant." Clara bowed her head, her heart aching. She knew that where she came from and the West were two different worlds. She also knew that rumors were inevitable, especially when a woman came out alone with a story no one had heard. Clara poured herself a cup of hot tea, the pleasant scent of mint wafting through the air. She sat by the kitchen window, her eyes fixed on the horses walking slowly in the distance. The creatures moved with a slow, powerful movement that made Clara feel the beauty of freedom without restraint. Perhaps that was why Jonas loved them so much that he was willing to rush into the chaos just to keep the horses safe. Ethan looked at Clara again, this time not as tense as before. Jonas looked for a pen pal because he didn't like the noise. He said she was different from other people, said she listened between lines. Clara gently squeezed the teacup in her hand. Her heart was touched by the soft emotions she had tried to hide. He wrote with such sincerity. "It helped me through a difficult time after losing my husband." "I appreciate his words," Ethan replied in a softer voice. He had never written to anyone so much. "I think you brought something to his mind that made him want to open up." A moment of silence fell between them. No awkwardness, just the honesty of two adults learning to deal with the unexpected. Clara put the dishes away. Ethan stood up to help her put the pot away, though he didn't say anything else. He seemed used to showing kindness, not with words, but with simple, quiet actions. When the cooking was finished, Clara went out onto the front porch. The vast expanse of air before her made her feel lighter. The field stretched out to the distant mountains, where a pale yellow glow still clung to the rocky peaks. Clara touched the wooden railing, feeling the cold air run down her palm. The West didn't talk much, but it knew how to make a person feel really small in this big world. It was that smallness that helped Clara realize that she still had room to start over. When Clara returned to the house, she found Ethan checking the lock on the stable door. He glanced at her and continued his work, without asking or commenting. His stoic expression made her realize that Ethan was not aloof. He had just lived so long protecting the peace of others that he had forgotten that he needed someone to care for him. Clara returned to her room. She placed her hand on the small notebook and wrote a few lines. Her handwriting was even and light, like each breath carefully planned after years of suffering. "I didn't know what awaited me at Whitlock Ranch, but I did feel one thing. This place was more than just a temporary shelter. It had a pulse of its own, so slow and deep that it took patience to understand it." She put down her pen. Outside in the hallway, someone's footsteps sounded. Clara recognized Ethan's pace, just like that, slow not hurried, not tired. Under this wooden roof, each person carries an old story. But perhaps that is what makes this place a land wide enough for many wounded hearts. She touched her palm lightly. The warmth was still there. Perhaps the hope was there too. Whitlock Ranch in Clara's early days always felt like a place watching the newcomer. The old logs, the thick barn walls, the fields that stretched to the foot of the mountain all watched her silently, as if testing her patience to survive here. Clara was not afraid of the silence. She had lived through much heavier days, where her heart was worn down by memories and suppressed thoughts. Silence felt like an old friend to her. Clara spent more time cleaning the kitchen and the main house, not because she wanted to show off, but simply to repay the kindness Jonas had shown her in his letter. She dusted the wooden table, straightened the crooked curtains, added a few pine branches to the vases to make the house less cold. No one had asked her to, but doing something with her hands made her feel like she belonged. When Clara gathered the wood chips to carry out the backyard, she saw Ethan mending the fence along the field. He worked tirelessly, as if keeping busy was the only way to keep his heart from being worn out by time. He had been a medic in the Civil War, Jonas had said in letters. A man who had seen so much loss wore a special defensiveness in his eyes. Clara watched Ethan from afar. His posture was as solid as a pillar, but his shoulders were heavy, like someone who carried many things he did not want to tell. He did not pay attention to her. This did not bother Clara. In the West, being quiet was not rude, but simply the choice of those who did not want to expose their hearts to the wind. A short time later, the sound of hooves echoed from the fence that ran along the road to the ranch. A man rode in, lean but muscular, with a tanned face and eyes as sharp as a hawk's. Clara had never seen him before, but the way he rode his sorrel horse showed he was familiar with the land. Ethan looked up as the man approached. His face changed, hardened. Clara sensed something was wrong in that look. The other man stopped his horse by the fence, glancing at Clara as if sizing up an unwanted stranger. His voice was hoarse, tinged with sarcasm. "I heard the Whitlocks have a new member. I came to see if he would be a good fit for Red Creek." Clara stood still, keeping her composure. Ethan stepped between them, his voice low but firm. "Caleb Rowan. You don't need to come here to judge anyone." Caleb straightened in his saddle, his lips curling into a faint smile. "Jonas brought his wife to the ranch by mail. The whole town knew about it. I just wanted to see if the rumors were true." Clara felt shame rising in her chest, not at Caleb's words, but at the fact that people would turn her story into something to talk about. But she couldn't blame them. Westerners were wary of the presence of anyone who didn't belong. Ethan stared at Caleb. "You are overstepping the mark." Caleb shrugged, his face defiant. It seemed the Whitlocks had more to hide than ever, and Jonas was in bed, not knowing when he would wake up. It was sad. Ethan tightened his grip on the saddle strap, his eyes darkening for a brief moment. Clara saw the anger trapped in them, like a flame trapped in thick ash. Clara took a step forward, not to confront, but to set a limit. Her voice was calm, soft but clear, like cool water running over stone. "I'm not here to make a fuss. I'm just a guest in this house. If you have any questions, just ask me. No need to insult others." Caleb was a little surprised that Clara didn't seem scared. He looked at her for a long moment, then chuckled. "I didn't expect her to be so bold." "Okay," I asked. "Do you think you can live in this land? It's not easy, especially for a soft-hearted person from the East." Clara looked him straight in the eye. "I have seen someone I love die in pain. I have lived many days with such emptiness that I did not know if I could stand up again. If I have lived through all that, I think this land cannot defeat me so easily." Caleb was silent for a moment. Clara's words were not challenging, but contained a force he did not expect. Before turning his horse to leave, Caleb spoke in a voice still full of sarcasm, but less edgy. "We'll see how long she lasts here." When he disappeared behind the dirt road, Ethan let out a long breath, not out of fear, but out of disgust at the man's presence. He's always like that. "Clara, don't let his words affect you." Clara looked at Ethan. What caught her attention wasn't what he said, but the way he stood with his shoulder tilted as if he were shielding someone he didn't even dare call family. "I don't mind. It's just that sometimes people forget that other people's pain isn't something to make fun of. Ethan looked at her for a moment, his eyes softening. She didn't have to explain anything to Caleb. He would keep talking until he got bored. That was his way. But I knew this story was making her look judgmental. Jonas knew it too. He just didn't think it would happen so quickly. Clara nodded. She thanked Ethan for the comment. There was an unvarnished sincerity in his voice. The air was quiet again. Only the wind blew through the wooden doors. Clara felt like she had entered a new cycle of life. But strangely, she didn't feel too heavy. The confrontation made her more aware of her place on the ranch temporary, but not meaningless. Whitlock Ranch was not an easy place to live, but it was a place filled with people trying to live right. Clara looked at the main house, where Jonas lay motionless. She wondered if he knew that two people at the ranch were trying to preserve his honor, even if no one said so. The West has its own way of speaking. Be silent when silence is needed. Stand up when standing up is needed. Clara took a deep breath. In that moment, she felt like she had placed a part of her heart in this land, even though she didn't know where it would lead. Clara entered the main house after her unpleasant encounter with Caleb Rowan. The atmosphere inside Ranch Whitlock was inexplicably different. There was something in the air, like undercurrents moving beneath the still earth. She couldn't name the feeling, but it made her heart flutter. Jonas was lying in the back room, and Ethan remained in the yard. The gate closed as if to block out the echoes of their encounter. Clara stood by the kitchen table and placed her hands on the old wood. The coolness of the wood under her palms calmed her a little. She looked around the house, noticing that every object was in its place, just as Jonas had described it in his letter. In each word, he had written carefully about his land, about how he believed people could be better off in the Great West. And now he lay there, unable to speak or move, unable to protect the woman he had so desperately wanted to bring here. There was a slight movement behind the door of the sick room. Clara walked over and gently opened it. Jonas was still lying there, his eyes closed, his breathing even but heavy. Half his face was illuminated in the dim light. She stood by the bed for a long time, not saying a word. There are some words that cannot be spoken. They exist only as breath, but cannot be translated into words. Clara set the freshly laundered towel on the table and adjusted the blanket. As she did so, she realized that the silence between her and Jonas was not awkward. Instead, it was like another kind of dialogue, each speaking with his own pain and hope. She didn't know if Jonas heard or understood, but Clara spoke softly. "I'll look after this place until you get well. I can't promise anything else, but this I can keep." She placed her hand on the edge of the bed. The warmth of Jonas's body radiated through the fabric. Clara's heart was stirred by the moment, not by love, but by compassion for a man who had tried to find a way out of loneliness, just like her. Just as Clara was about to leave the room, footsteps echoed softly in the hallway. Ethan appeared, his voice low and slightly hoarse. "I'll bring some firewood in. This room is a bit colder than the rest of the house." Clara nodded. Ethan entered the room, placed the logs in the fireplace, and lit the fire with practiced movements. He didn't look at Clara as he worked, but the flickering light told her something else. As Ethan leaned closer to the hearth, she noticed his hands were shaking slightly, not from cold, but from something deeper, perhaps from fear the man would never admit. "You worry about Jonas a lot, don't you?" Ethan didn't answer right away. He closed the fireplace door, then stood up, wiping his hands on an old towel. "Jonas was the only person who was there for me when I returned from the war. He saw me on days when I didn't want to see myself. People like that are hard to find. I just hope he'll open his eyes again, to say a word or even reproach me." Clara was silent, for no words were enough to console such a pain. That loyalty made her feel Ethan was like an old tree that had been beaten by storms many times but still stood, though its trunk was cracked. Then Ethan looked at her. His eyes held something she could hardly read. Caleb came here today because he wanted Jonas to see that he still had influence in town. But Jonas can't see anymore, and he knows it. "I don't want you to worry. Jonas deserves more respect than that." Clara sat down in a chair at the table. She didn't look at Ethan as she spoke. "You're worried that my presence here will make people think Jonas is weak. aren't you?" Ethan paused slightly. Not that she understood. It was just, this town wasn't used to incomplete stories. They liked things that were easy to understand, and Jonas and her story wasn't easy to understand. Clara squeezed her hand lightly. It was hard to understand. I came here as a wife on paper, someone who was supposed to fill the void Jonas wanted to fill, but when he fell before I could hold his hand for the first time, everything changed. Ethan looked at her for a long time. Finally, he spoke in a tone that was almost confessional. One thing was clear to me. She wasn't here out of desperation. She was looking for a place to live. She wasn't here to cling to Jonas. She wanted to exist in a place where her past wouldn't consume her. Clara choked up a little at those words. She didn't say what was on her mind, but Ethan saw more than she could have imagined. He left the room, leaving Clara in a long silence. Clara turned to look at Jonas. His face was strangely peaceful, but something held her back. It felt as if Jonas was hiding a secret that he would only be able to tell when he woke up. His silence was not a void, but a wall that hid something that was not yet revealed. Clara walked down the hallway. When she reached the end of the hall, the wind blew in through the small window. She stood there, took a deep breath, and realized her heart was moving in a way she hadn't intended. Ethan stepped out onto the porch and stood in the space in front of the door. Clara saw his back hunch slightly, as if he were burdened with something he could not share. She wanted to say something to ease his mind, but every man in the West had a small area in his heart that no one else was allowed to enter. Suddenly, the sound of horse hooves was heard in the distance. Ethan turned to look at Clara. "Someone is coming." Clara followed his gaze, a premonition awakening an unnamed feeling. She suddenly understood that life at Red Creek was more than land and silence. It was also about unexpected encounters, secrets about to surface, and wounds each tried to hide. In that moment, Clara knew one thing for sure. She was no longer just a guest at the ranch. She was part of what was to come. The sound of hooves echoed down the long dirt road, steady and heavy, a sign of what was about to touch life at Whitlock Ranch. Clara stood by the door, her hand unconsciously touching the old wooden frame as if to calm herself. Ethan stepped onto the porch, his eyes on the ranch entrance. His posture was tense, not with fear, but with the wariness that came with years of war and more than half his life in the wilderness. A figure on a gray horse emerged from the dust. As she got closer, Clara saw it wasn't Caleb. The man was several years younger than Caleb. His face was thin, his lips pressed together, as if he had something to say but didn't want to. A wide-brimmed hat hid his features. But when the light touched him, Clara saw that his dark brown eyes seemed to have a fire in them. The man stopped his horse by the gate, took off his hat, and bowed politely. "I'm Sam McGree. I'm here on behalf of Dr. Willard. He wants to check on Jonas." Ethan stepped down onto the field, his eyes still not entirely convinced. "I thought Dr. Willard came himself." Sam dismounted, brushing the dust off his cloak. "He's busy dealing with a case in town, so he sent me ahead to check on things. If necessary, he'll come right away." Ethan looked at Sam for a long time, as if trying to gauge how much truth there was in what the man said. Finally, he nodded and stepped aside to let Sam enter the house. Clara felt her chest tighten as Sam passed. For some reason, his presence made her uneasy. It was unspoken, just a chill down her spine. She watched Sam walk toward Jonas's room, with the vague feeling that this man was more than just a doctor's messenger. Ethan stood next to Clara, not taking his eyes off Sam. "Do you see anything strange?" Clara replied softly. "There was something, like he was hiding something, but I couldn't be sure." Ethan slowly exhaled. "I think so, too." They entered the house. Sam stood beside Jonas's bed, leaning over to look. He did not touch the patient immediately, but studied every line on Jonas's face. His eyes were not the eyes of someone coming to check on a patient. They were too focused, too quiet, and something like regret or remorse was buried deep inside. Clara took a step back. Sam opened his leather pouch, took out a small copper tube, and pressed it to Jonas's chest. He listened for a long time, longer than necessary. Ethan leaned against the doorframe, his arms crossed, his face impassive but his eyes watching Sam's every move. After finishing his check, Sam stood up and closed his bag. He turned to Ethan and Clara. His breathing is fine, his heartbeat is steady, but consciousness is still unresponsive. It could take a few more weeks, Ethan said coldly. Doctor, Willard said a few days. Sam looked down at the floor, then up, his voice slow. Jonas's condition changes with every beat. No one can be sure of anything. But there is something I think you should know. The room became thick. Clara looked at Sam, waiting for him to continue. Jonas had been in town before the accident. He told the doctor he had a bad headache, so bad that he was having trouble concentrating while riding. Dr. Willard suggested he take a few weeks off, but Jonas said he had some unfinished business at the ranch and something important to do with his family. Ethan gripped the shoulder of the chair nearby. Sam's words seemed to open a door full of hidden secrets. Clara listened to each word as if it were a stone falling into her heart. Jonas had been so overcome with grief that he had lost control of himself. But he had tried to continue his work. It was unlike the cautious man he was. Clara remembered the last letter Jonas had sent her. He had written with anticipation, but there were also broken passages, like someone struggling between wanting to say something and wanting to hide something. Clara exclaimed very softly, "He hid this from us." Sam looked at Clara, his eyes softening. "I don't think he wanted anyone to worry. Many men in this area are like that. They take it all in their stride. When it happens, there's no one to help." Ethan turned his head away, his jaw clenched as if to keep from breaking. His voice was hoarse. He promised to tell me if something happened. But Clara felt a strange pang. She hadn't known Jonas long enough to speak of his promises, but in his letters he had always been considerate. So, the fact that Jonas hadn't shared his pain with his brother cut deep. Sam gathered his things and stood near the door. As he passed Clara, he paused for a moment. She was the one Jonas was talking about. In his letter to the doctor, Jonas said he hoped she would find peace here. Clara stood still at the words. Her chest swelled with an indescribable emotion. Jonas had never said that to her before. He had always written with sincerity, but he had never said that he hoped he could bring her peace. Sam put on his hat. "I have to get back to town. If anything changes, send someone for me. I'll tell Dr. Willard." Sam left the ranch. Ethan stood still for a long time as he disappeared down the dirt road. Clara stepped closer, her hand lightly touching the doorframe. "It seems Jonas has more on his mind than we thought," Ethan said softly, his voice heavy. He didn't say anything. He hid his pain as usual. He kept it all inside. Deborah had been like that too. Clara turned, her gaze slowing. "Deborah, is your wife?" Ethan didn't answer right away. A long silence settled over him like dust in a stable. Finally he nodded. "She passed away a few years ago. I couldn't help her when she needed me most." Clara understood that Ethan wasn't talking about his woes. It was a truth he had kept hidden for so long, a part of his history he didn't want anyone to touch. But today, amid his uncertainty and worry, he revealed a small piece. She felt it. She softened her voice. Jonas would get through it, and he would get through his pain. Ethan looked at her, his eyes filled with old hurt, but also a small glimmer of hope. "I hope she is right." The wind blew through the porch, carrying dust and the sounds of the wide west. Clara stood beside Ethan, realizing they were both trying to keep from breaking under things too big to bear alone. Something is changing, both subtle and powerful. A new secret is revealed. A trust is beginning to form, and a connection between people is growing quietly, bit by bit, like water flowing underground. Whitlock Ranch was filled with a long silence that felt as if the house held its breath. Rare rays of light filtered through the windows, casting long streaks on the wooden floor, and Jonas's room was as still as the sleep of a man who had traveled too long. Clara walked slowly into the sick room, set a bowl of warm water on the bedside table, and sat down beside him. Through many days here, she has learned many things about the silence of the West. Not the cold silence, but the silence that contains unsaid things, unspoken worries, and the fragile hope that is kindling in the hearts of those who stay. Jonas lay there, breathing steadily but showing no signs of waking up. Clara took a soft cloth, dipped it in water, wrung it out, and wiped it across his forehead. She didn't know if Jonas could feel the warmth, but each time she did, her heart softened a little. After a few gentle wipes, Clara noticed Jonas's fingers moving slightly. She paused, unsure if she was seeing things. Clara reached for his hand. This time, his fingers did curl slightly, as if trying to grasp something. Clara gasped, her eyes wide. She called softly, "Jonas, can you hear me?" There was no answer, not a sound from the motionless man. Only the twitching of the finger was evidence that this sleep was not entirely closed. She stood up, walked quickly to the door, and called out loudly, "Ethan!" A moment later, his heavy footsteps echoed down the hallway. Ethan appeared in the doorway, his shirt still dusty from working in the yard. He looked at her face and saw something was different. "What's up?" Clara pointed to the bed, Jonas's finger. "I saw him move, slightly, but clearly." Ethan came closer and bent down to examine it closely. He stood still as a statue, his eyes unblinking, but Jonas lay still again, as still as before. Clara saw the disappointment flash across Ethan's face, but also saw a small glimmer of hope in his eyes. "It might be a reflex," Ethan said softly, but his voice couldn't hide the slight tremor. Clara did not argue. She knew there were signs that made the human heart want to believe more than analyze. "I think it means something," she said softly. Ethan turned to look at her, as if he wanted to say something, but stopped. "I'll keep an eye on him. If he moves, we'll notify Dr. Willard." Clara nodded. He walked out of the room, but Clara saw Ethan's shoulders relax a little. It was like the darkness that had been holding the ranch back had been pushed back a little. When Ethan was gone, Clara sat down in a chair, her hands on the edge of the bed. Her heart was pounding with anticipation. She had seen movement, as small as wind on water. It was a flash to her, but that hope brought with it another feeling. A question silently scratched at her mind. What would happen if Jonas woke up? Could their relationship become anything? Or was she just a guest that fate had thrust into his life? At the moment when he was at his most cruel, Clara put her hand to her chest, trying to control her emotions. She didn't want to think about what was happening anymore. Just knowing Jonas was there, knowing there was a chance, was enough. While Clara was still sitting there, the sound of the door opening startled her. Ethan returned with a hesitant look in his eyes. "I don't want to bother you, but there's something I have to ask." Clara looked up. His voice was low. "Did you ever think Jonas wrote to you for something other than wanting a home?" The question made Clara tighten her grip on her handkerchief. She answered slowly, disjointedly, as if she were walking through a land of memories. "Mr. Jonas wrote the letter with a very sincere heart. He did not promise anything beyond his ability. He just wanted to find someone to share the rest of his life with. And I needed a place to stand." Ethan looked at her for so long that Clara found it hard to breathe. Finally, he lowered his voice. Maybe he knew he didn't have much time left. Maybe bringing her here was something he had planned all along. Clara was shocked. She stood up and took a step back. "What do you mean?" Ethan looked out the window, where the ground stretched out as if to embrace the world. "Sam said Jonas told the doctor he had a bad headache. Jonas wasn't the type to ignore a serious illness. If he knew he was worse than we thought, maybe he wanted to make sure the ranch wasn't abandoned after he got in trouble." Clara heard each word as if someone were pulling the breath from her chest. She felt the trembling in her soul. "You're saying Jonas invited me here not because of me, but because he cares about the ranch? About you?" Ethan was silent. A very heavy silence. Clara clutched the bed, trying to keep herself from collapsing. It felt like she was being sucked into a whirlwind with no top in sight. She wasn't angry at Jonas. She just felt empty, as if everything that had been clear before was crumbling. Ethan looked at Clara. His eyes weren't as hard as usual, but filled with regret for saying something that might have hurt her. "I'm not sure. I'm just stating the possibility that comes to mind. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe he really wanted you to come for yourself. But I don't want you to be hurt by any surprises later." Clara sat down in a chair, her arms around herself. She spoke softly, like the wind touching the ground. "I'm not afraid of the truth. It's just, I need to know what I'm getting into." Ethan stood there for a long time. Finally, he spoke very quietly. If Jonas woke up, she would have answers. Clara didn't look at him. Ethan walked out, leaving the emptiness surrounding him like a thick coat that was difficult to remove. Jonas's soft breathing was the only sound in the room. Clara looked at him for a long moment, then closed her eyes. She whispered something to whom she wasn't sure. "Wake up, so I know where your heart is." Outside the ranch. The wind picked up dust and carried the scent of the wide west. Clara felt like she was at a strange crossroads between truth and hope. It was as if things had just begun. The air in the hospital room was as still water. Clara sat there, waiting for the slightest movement from Jonas's hand, but after that vague moment, everything was still again. The silence stretched on, filling her with both hope and fear. As she sat by the bed for longer, Clara noticed something strange. Jonas's breathing became clearer, more even and deeper than before. It was as if his body was calling him back from afar. Clara changed the cloth and gently placed it on his forehead. She saw Jonas frown slightly. It wasn't a reflex. It wasn't an involuntary movement. It had a soul. Clara leaned closer, her heart pounding. "Jonas, can you hear me?" He didn't open his eyes, but the corners of his lips twitched slightly, as if he were trying to speak in a deep sleep. Clara leaned closer and whispered, "Someone is waiting for you to come back. I am waiting too." A mist seemed to cover Jonas's consciousness. Somewhere in his mind, he heard the sound of running water and the sound of horses' hooves fading away. A strange scene appeared. He found himself standing in a dusty field, with the silhouette of a woman in a pale dress, her back turned. He could not see her face, only her hair blowing in the wind. He tried to move, but his feet felt glued to the ground. The woman said something, very low, very far away. A soft call, warm as a fire. Jonas tried to reach out and touch the figure, but each time his hand came closer, she retreated a step. Only when the call became clearer did the figure turn. It was not the face of the woman he had lost. It was Clara's face, like a light piercing a dream. Jonas let out a small gasp. Clara felt the change, her heart pounding so fast she had to put a hand to her chest to steady herself. Jonas's lips moved. She leaned closer. He tried to speak, but the sound came out as a small, weak, struggling groan. Clara called out quickly, "Ethan, come here, quick!" Footsteps echoed through the hallway. Ethan entered, looking alarmed, but froze when he saw Jonas move. Ethan's hard features softened. He stepped closer, placing a hand on Jonas's shoulder. "Jonas, it's me, Ethan." Jonas frowned harder, forcing his eyes open as if being held down by an invisible force. A thin, hoarse sound escaped his lips. "Yes, yes." Clara put her hand to her mouth, not believing what she was hearing. Ethan leaned closer, his voice choked. "It's me. Hey, I'm here. Calm down." Jonas tried to say another word, but his breathing slowed again. His body relaxed, falling into a state of half-consciousness. Still, those few syllables were enough to brighten the room. The long, heavy days suddenly had a small crack through which light could seep. Ethan stepped back, placing his hand on Jonas's forehead. When he turned to Clara, his eyes were red, like someone who had just walked through an emotional storm. "He heard us. That means consciousness is returning." Clara sat down in her chair, her legs shaking slightly with emotion. What she saw filled her heart with new faith. Not blind faith, but the kind that grows from small evidence, like green shoots emerging from dry soil. Ethan continued, his voice lower. "I'll ride to town and tell Dr. Willard. He must know this at once." Clara nodded. Ethan heard the nod as if he agreed to leave. He placed his hand on Clara's shoulder, a light touch, both in thanks and in sharing the joy that was rising in both of their hearts. "I'll be back as soon as possible." He left the room, his steps more steady than they had been a few hours ago, a change in Ethan that Clara could see clearly. Hope pulled him back to himself. When Clara and Jonas were alone in the room, she sat down on the edge of the bed. She opened her eyes and looked at the man sleeping deeply. The tension in his face had lessened. In the dim light, he looked gentler, more vulnerable, and much more approachable than the independent, tough cowboy he had been in the letter. Clara touched the back of Jonas's hand lightly. A part of her soul bloomed like a wild flower in a dry land. She spoke softly, so as not to tire him further. "I'm here. You don't have to look for anyone in your dreams anymore." Her voice trembled slightly, not from worry, but from the revelation. Jonas was not as unfamiliar as she had thought. Unconsciously, in his dream, he had called Ethan's name and seen her. There were connections not made by time, but by the need of the heart to call to itself. Clara stroked the blanket. "When you wake up, I will ask you everything that was left unsaid." Outside, the sound of hooves faded. Ethan was galloping toward Red Creek, looking for Dr. Willard. Clara closed her eyes and leaned back in her chair. She felt her heart beat slower, deeper. Not the knife of worry, but the beat of hope. But in that moment, a thought flashed through his mind, cold and sharp as the wind on a field. Sam McGree had said that Jonas had been having severe headaches. They had been going on since before the accident. If Jonas woke up, he might bring the truth everyone was waiting for but afraid to hear. Clara opened her eyes and looked into Jonas's peaceful face. She wasn't just waiting for him to wake up so she could feel safe. She was waiting for him to wake up so she could find out what he had been hiding. A gust of wind blew into the room, causing the curtains to flutter slightly. Clara placed her hand over her heart. The West never gave anyone an easy life, but it always gave people a second chance. She hopes Jonas will have that chance too. After Ethan left, the house fell into a vast silence. Only Jonas's breathing was steady, like slow steps on a long road. Clara sat by his bed a moment longer before standing, feeling she should check everything in the house. Since Sam's appearance, a thin shadow had clung to her mind. Clara walked out into the hallway, her hand lightly touching the wooden wall. The ranch wood was old but solid, like the people who lived in it sometimes chipped, but still strong. As she walked down the front steps, the wind blew, carrying the familiar smell of dry earth. The ranch was as vast as the ocean, making one feel both small and embraced. Clara looked out at the fields where Ethan worked. Even when he wasn't there, his presence lingered in every fence, every boot print. She let out a small breath, trying to calm the fluttering inside her. Jonas's turning was a good sign, but it also left unanswered questions. A small noise from the stable made Clara turn. She didn't think anyone was still at the ranch, but the sound didn't sound like an animal, more like deliberately light footsteps. Clara walked slowly to the stable, her hand on the wooden door. The moment the door opened, a figure flashed past. Clara jumped, but the man turned immediately. It was the ranch's longtime caretaker, Uncle Tom Hargreaves. She hadn't seen much of him, only that he had been the stable boy since Jonas's father was alive. Uncle Tom bowed to her. "Sorry to bother you. I came to check the hay. The barn needs cleaning again in a few days." Clara nodded, but she could still hear the confusion in his voice. She looked around, noticing a cloth bag sitting in the corner of the cage. It looked like someone had hurriedly hidden something. "Where have you been?" Clara asked quietly. Uncle Tom rubbed his neck. "I just circled around the east side. The wind was so strong, I was afraid the roof would blow off." Clara said nothing more, but a small ripple stirred in her heart. Her eyes rested on the duffel bag again. She did not ask, for there were some things in the West that no one wanted to interfere with, especially newcomers. But her instinct told her that the trouble at Ranch Whitlock was not just due to Jonas's illness. Clara went back into the house, pushing the thought aside. She needed to take care of Jonas first. When she reached the sick room, she saw Jonas stirring as if trying to wake from a heavy sleep. Clara sat down next to him, her lips pursed with nervousness. "Mr. Jonas." "I'm here." Jonas's face was twisted in a deep sleep. He whispered something, his voice so hoarse that Clara had to lean close to hear it. The words were broken and indistinct, but they chilled her. "No, don't. Ethan, stay away." Clara shuddered slightly. The words were like a sharp wind cutting through the air. What was he dreaming about that made his mind rebel so violently? She held Jonas's shoulder gently. "It's okay. No one is going to hurt you." Jonas slowly relaxed, but the broken words of his dream were like shards of glass stabbing into Clara's heart. She wanted to believe it was just a dream, but a cold current welled up inside her. Jonas might be carrying some truth, something he wanted to protect Ethan from, or vice versa. Clara sat by the bed for a long time before leaving the room. She went to the kitchen to prepare some warm water when there was a sudden knock on the door. The sound was not loud, but it was firm, as if someone wanted something serious. When Clara opened the door, she saw Caleb Rowan standing there. His face was more serious than the day before, without the obvious irony. Caleb looked at her a long time before speaking. "Is Ethan here?" Clara shook her head. "He just came into town to see the doctor." "What's the matter?" Caleb didn't answer right away. He looked around the ranch, his eyes sharp as someone who knew every little aberration here. "I have something to say to Jonas, but it doesn't seem like the right time yet." Clara stepped out the door, trying to keep her voice calm. "Jonas is in a semi-conscious state. If he has anything important to say, I can write it down." Caleb's lips curled, but it wasn't a smile. He lowered his voice, his words heavier than stone. "There are things that outsiders shouldn't hear. Do you understand?" The remark was like a blow to the pride of a horse. Clara did not retreat. She simply stood, looking straight at him. "If it has to do with Jonas, I'm not an outsider." Caleb looked at her for a few more seconds. She read something different in his eyes, concern, maybe even guilt. It unsettled Clara more than it challenged her. Caleb said softly, "I just want him to know. It's not what he thinks. That accident was not simple, and the people involved in it were not just me." Clara stiffened. "What do you mean?" Caleb stepped back, his voice growing hoarse. "When Jonas wakes, everything will be clear, but she must be prepared, because the truth is sometimes not what we want." He mounted his horse and left so quickly that the dust did not even fall. Clara stood still in the doorway. Her heart was spinning like a leaf caught in a whirlpool. Caleb's words were unclear, but they were enough to stir a great storm inside her. She turned back into the house, walking slowly, as if afraid of breaking the ground. In the hospital room, Jonas frowned again. Something is about to rise from the depths of the past. Clara stood in his doorway, her hand on her heart. She knew life at Ranch Whitlock was about to change. All signs pointed to one thing: Jonas had not met with the random accident everyone said he had. Someone knows the truth. Someone is trying to hide. And there are people who are tormented by what they did. Clara whispered, "Jonas, come back. We need to know what happened to you." The wind from the porch suddenly whistled through the cracks in the door, like a warning from the open country. Whitlock Ranch was keeping a secret it didn't want to reveal. And Clara, though new, was closer to the truth than anyone else. Clara returned to Jonas's room, still reeling from Caleb Rowan's words. The light in the room was softer, filtering through the curtains, giving the room a soft yellow hue like the warmth left by the blanket covering Jonas. He lay still, his breathing deeper and more even than usual. She held his hand, feeling the life filling his body. Clara didn't know how long it was before Jonas suddenly stirred. This time, it wasn't an involuntary twitch. He groaned softly, his head tilting to one side as if trying to escape the shadow of the dream that was weighing him down. Clara leaned forward, her heart pounding. "Mr. Jonas, can you hear me?" Jonas's eyelashes fluttered. Then, slowly, with great difficulty, he opened his eyes. His vision was not sharp at first, but blurred like the mist on a lake. But he realized that someone was sitting next to him. His gaze stopped on Clara, confused as someone who finds something familiar but does not understand why. Clara bent down. "I'm Clara." Do you remember Jonas took a few seconds to open and close his eyes, as if trying to pull a memory out of the darkness? The corners of his lips lifted a little, not a full smile, but a fragile warmth. Isn't this a dream? Clara felt her throat tighten. No, it's me. Really? Jonas blinked, his eyelashes feeling the weight of long, sleepless days. He reached up to touch her hand, but he was too weak. Clara took his hand. Jonas looked down at their touching hands, as if trying to make sure he was no longer drifting in a lonely dream. He spoke weakly but clearly. "I tried to find her, but I don't seem to remember much." Clara held her breath to calm down. "He has been in a coma for a long time. He will slowly remember." Jonas winced, as if a sharp pain had struck deep in his head. He closed his eyes for a moment before his breathing evened out. "I saw Ethan. In my dream. And someone warned me of something." Clara held his hand tighter. "Can you continue?" Jonas opened his eyes. There was a faint uneasiness and fear in his gaze, like someone who knows he is about to remember something he does not want to face. A sentence burst from his lips, hoarse as if pulled from a cliff. It was no accident. Clara. Clara felt as if the ground were tilting beneath her. She had to lean against the bed to keep her balance. Jonas continued, each word stabbing into the air. "I remember part of it. Someone was there. I heard gunshots." Clara took a deep breath, her heart pounding heavily. She leaned closer, her voice trembling slightly. "Who do you remember anyone there?" Jonas tried to search his memory, but his body cringed as pain shot through his temples. Clara quickly placed a hand on his shoulder. "Stop! You're not strong enough." Jonas opened his eyes and looked at her apologetically. "I don't know the face, but it wasn't an accident. Out there, someone wants me not to come back." Clara felt a chill run down her spine. Everything she had been guessing about all these days was now coming together. Caleb said someone else was involved. Jonas had dreamed of the gunshots too. The truth was beginning to unfold, even if only in fragments. Jonas looked at Clara's eyes, which were filled with worry. He tried to raise his hand to touch her cheek, but his strength was too weak. Clara bent down so that his hand could rest on her face. The sensation made Jonas close his eyes, as if finding a foothold after the storm. "I'm sorry. I scared you." Clara pressed her hand lightly against the back of his. "I chose to be here. I'm not afraid of trouble. I'm just afraid you'll forget how to get back." Jonas's breath seemed to ease a little. His eyes softened, no longer filled with the torment they had felt when he first woke up. He looked at her for a long time, as if to engrave her presence into his mind, just waking from a long sleep. "Mrs. Clara, have we spoken by letter?" Clara smiled, enough to dispel the darkness in the room. "Yes, more than you think." Jonas frowned. "I reread her last letter. Before..." Clara squeezed his hand. "Before he fell off his horse. Right?" He nodded slightly. "I remember feeling hopeful. It had been a long time since I had felt that way." Clara bowed her head, her heart burning as if someone had just placed a small fire in it. Jonas looked at her a moment longer. Then his eyes grew heavy, not from unconsciousness, but from exhaustion. Clara gently placed his hand on the bed and pulled the covers up. Jonas fell into a light sleep, breathing evenly, but without the panicked dreams. Clara stood, trying to keep her heart from shaking. She knew Jonas was telling the truth. The memories were incomplete, but clear. She stepped out into the hallway and saw Ethan in the distance, returning with Dr. Willard. Ethan's face was a mixture of worry and hope. Ethan asked as soon as he stepped onto the steps, "Is he awake?" Clara nodded. Not long, but he was awake. He was able to say a few words. Ethan bowed his head in gratitude. "Doctor—" Willard walked quickly into the room. Ethan started to follow, but Clara put her hand on his arm, the cool feeling of the air on his coat making her heart sink. "Ethan, I need to tell you this before the doctor evaluates Jonas's condition." He stopped, his eyes filled with an unnamed fear. Clara said very softly. Jonas remembered something about the accident. Ethan's eyes darkened, as if swept by darkness. "What did he say?" Clara shook her head. "Not much, but he sure has a gun." Ethan stood still. His face didn't change dramatically, but something cracked ever so slightly, like a thin layer of snow falling from a roof. Gunfire means someone did it on purpose. Clara could sense the pain in his voice. She stepped closer. "Ethan, can you think of anyone?" Ethan didn't answer right away. His breathing was heavier than usual. He looked out at the land, where old fences stretched like threads across the earth. "I don't know for sure, Clara, but if someone wanted Jonas gone, they might still be around." A chill ran down Clara's spine. The ranch was too big and too peaceful to reveal the danger lurking around. Ethan returned to the sick room before Clara could say more. She stood on the porch for a moment, looking toward the stables and the corner where she had seen the duffel bag. Doubts coalesced into a dark patch in her mind. Someone is hiding something. And Jonas only remembered half the picture. Clara took a deep breath, placing her hand on her chest. The real storm is coming. Jonas slept for a long time after he had spoken his first memory fragments. Dr. Willard examined him carefully, redressed his head, and told Clara and Ethan not to let him try to remember too much at once. The mind, fresh from a deep coma, was like a land that had just been through drought. It could not be forced back immediately. When the doctor left, Ethan stood by the bed for a moment, watching Jonas's face with an unspeakable look in his eyes. Clara stood back, giving him some space. The only sound in the room was the breeze blowing through the eaves. Ethan took a slow breath, then asked softly, "Jonas, can you hear me?" Jonas opened his eyes slowly. The haze was not as strong as when he first woke, but his gaze was still heavy, as if trying to distinguish between reality and dream. He glanced at Ethan, his lashes fluttering slightly. "I hear it's just hard to put it all together." Ethan bent down, his hands resting lightly on the bed frame. "It's okay. Say what you can, or don't. Don't force yourself." Jonas blinked, then turned to Clara. She was standing near the window, but their eyes still met. He looked at her as if searching for support. Clara moved closer to the bed. "Jonas, if you want to stop any time, I'll be here." Jonas smiled slightly, a tired but genuine smile. "How long have you been here?" Clara replied softly. "Since he was unconscious? I only left when necessary." Jonas looked down at his hands, speaking softly as if surprised himself. "I heard her voice in my dream. I thought my mind was confused. I didn't expect she was really here." Ethan looked at them both, his eyes warm but also hesitant, as if he was witnessing something that both relieved and alarmed him. Clara sat down next to Jonas, keeping her voice soft. "Jonas, what do you remember about that incident?" The air sagged. Jonas closed his eyes, his chest rising and falling slowly. He was trying to find his way in his own darkness. "I remember leaving town. The horse was running faster than usual. I was confused. Someone called my name. Then I saw a figure standing on the slope. The sound of a horse neighing. A loud bang. Clara felt every word he said, like a stone falling into her heart. Jonas opened his eyes and looked at Ethan. "I think someone is after me. It wasn't a horse that slipped. I'm sure of it." Ethan gripped the bed frame tightly. He forced himself to ask, "Do you see anyone? A face or a shadow?" Jonas shook his head. "I only saw a long shadow. I couldn't tell who it was, but I remember someone screaming before I fell." Clara placed her hand on Jonas's arm, feeling his muscles tense slightly with the effort of remembering. Do you remember if the voice was male or female? Jonas thought for a long time. His face was so tight that Clara feared another headache was coming on. But when he opened his eyes, his gaze was downcast. Male voice. Younger than me. Not familiar, but not unfamiliar either. Ethan paused. His expression changed for a split second. Clara noticed the slight change. Jonas continued, his voice trembling slightly as if haunted by the memory. I heard that. Very clearly. Don't shoot. Clara felt her whole body go numb. Jonas breathed heavily, then threw himself back on the pillows. Don't shoot. That means there are two people. One shoots, one protests. Ethan took a step back, his hand on his forehead, as if his mind was racing with a thought he didn't want to believe. Clara looked at him, her voice soft. Ethan? You know what Ethan reluctantly replied. I need to think clearly. Clara stepped closer to him, her voice small but firm. Jonas risked remembering. He might as well say what he thought. Ethan was silent for a long time before speaking softly, his eyes not leaving the wooden floor. I heard Caleb argue with Jonas about dividing the land sometimes, but I doubt he would go that far. As for the others, they might have their reasons, but none of them would dare to do that. Clara remembered the cloth bag in the stable. She told herself she would check it again when she got a chance. Jonas opened his eyes again, looking straight at Ethan, his voice weak but serious. Ethan, I need you to be honest. Did you see anyone following me that day? Ethan looked up. His eyes flashed with pain. No. If I saw it, I would have said it. The words sounded true, but there was a faint haze of smoke. Clara recognized it, but did not press it. Westerners have secrets that stick to their skin like dust. To get them out, you have to wait for the right moment. Jonas sighed, his hands lightly gripping the blanket. I want to know the truth, not just for me, but for all of us. Because if someone shoots me, they might come back. Clara felt a chill down her spine. Ethan gripped the bed again. I will protect you. Whoever it is, I will find out. Jonas looked at him gratefully, but there was still a hint of doubt in his eyes, like someone who had been betrayed by something but could not remember it all. Clara interjected, Jonas, you need to rest. The doctor said not to exert yourself. We'll ask you more questions when your head is clear. Jonas nodded slightly. Clara pulled her chair closer to the bed, holding his hand until his breathing became even and slow. Ethan stood by the door for a moment, looking at the two of them like a painting he couldn't quite place. He spoke softly, his voice low. Clara, who do you think did this? Clara replied slowly. I don't know, but that person is still around somewhere. And what worries me more is that that person doesn't just want Jonas to be quiet. He wants him gone. Ethan stood still, saying nothing. He looked out at the ranch yard where the wind was pushing the grass sideways. The silence was no longer peace, but a veil of darkness waiting to rise. Clara turned to Jonas, watching him sleep. She felt his hand move slightly in hers, as if he were trying to keep something from slipping from his mind. Jonas has come back from the brink, but the truth he holds is tearing the air and preparing to pull everyone into its center. After Jonas had fallen back into a much-needed restorative sleep, Clara stood silently in the room for a long time, watching every little movement of his face. Jonas slept deeply, but not as stiffly as before. There was something in his breathing that made her sense that the memories that had just surfaced had taken a great deal of his strength. Ethan left the room quietly, leaving a silence behind. Clara stepped out into the hallway, taking a moment to piece together what she had just heard. It felt like an old scarf was slowly being pulled back, revealing the interwoven threads within, each thread carrying a story that someone had tried to hide. Clara walked down to the porch. The air outside was fresher, but it felt heavy, like the low-hanging clouds on the mountainside. The dry grass swayed gently in the thin breeze. Everything was so quiet that she felt like the slightest noise would shatter the silence. From a distance, she caught a glimpse of Tom Hargreaves leading a horse out of the stable. His face was downcast, avoiding her gaze. Clara watched closely, sensing the awkwardness he was trying to hide. She approached, her voice gentle. "Uncle Tom, is everything okay?" He didn't turn his head immediately, but his hand movement paused for a moment. "I just took this horse out to have his hooves checked. He's been a little fussy lately." Clara stood a few feet away from him. She could feel the slight tension in the air, like a string being pulled close to its breaking point. "Uncle Tom, you've been at the ranch a long time. You've known Jonas since before Ethan was an adult. Have you noticed anything unusual lately?" Tom jerked his hand slightly, stumbled a little, and then steadied himself. He turned away, his eyes avoiding eye contact. "I'm not sure I can say anything useful," Clara replied slowly, not forcing, but not letting him back down easily either. Sometimes the smallest things are the most important. After a few seconds of silence, Tom leaned his head closer, as if against himself. "I saw some strange shoe prints behind the barn a few days ago. They didn't come from anyone at the ranch." Clara tried to keep her voice calm. "Are you sure?" Tom nodded. "Probably. I've lived here too long to know which mark belongs to whom." Clara thanked him with a slight look. The atmosphere between them suddenly became difficult to interpret. Tom bowed his head and continued in a hoarse voice. "I hope Jonas gets better soon. He's a good man. He doesn't deserve to be dragged into this." Clara wanted to ask more, but it was clear that Tom had just overstepped his bounds. She stepped back, giving him space, then returned to the house with a heavy heart. When she entered the kitchen, Ethan was standing by the sink, his face turned down as if he were hiding something. Clara watched his posture, the stiffness in his shoulders, the clenched fists of repression. She called softly, "Ethan!" He raised his head, trying to look normal. "Do you need anything?" Clara shook her head. "I just wanted to ask, what were you thinking when you heard Jonas talking about the gunshots?" Ethan glanced toward the window. The light reflected off his features, revealing a conflict he couldn't hide better. "I was angry. Not angry at Jonas, but angry at the person who had done it. Angry that I wasn't there." Clara stepped closer. "But I feel like you're hiding something." Ethan looked straight into her eyes. The determination in his eyes mixed with pain, creating an expression that made Clara's breathing slow. "Clara, I'm just trying to keep things together. This ranch, my whole life is tied to it. Jonas is the only family I have left. I'm afraid if I dig too deep, I won't be able to bear the consequences," Clara said softly. "The truth does not disappear just because we avoid it." Ethan clenched his fist, then released it, sighing. "I know, but I need to prepare my mind first." Clara nodded, not pressing further. Someone who had lost as much as Ethan deserved to breathe in his own space before facing the storm. They were silent for a while before Clara returned to Jonas's room, but as she got closer, a figure standing in the hallway made her stop. Caleb Rowan. He leaned against the wall, his arms crossed, his gaze fixed on Jonas's door as if on guard. Clara felt her heart tighten like a tight string. Caleb stepped out of the shadows. I heard Jonas said a few words. Clara kept her distance, her voice calm. "What do you want from him?" Caleb looked at her, his eyes sharper than ever. "I want to know what he remembers," Clara replied immediately, not letting his skepticism get the better of her. "And you? What do you know?" Caleb smiled slightly, a smile that held no mirth. "Clara, some things aren't as simple as you think. Jonas and I argued, but that doesn't mean I want him gone." Clara looked deep into his eyes, trying to read what he was not saying. If not you, then who? Caleb replied so quickly she felt he had been thinking about it for a long time. "The one who benefits most from Jonas's silence isn't me." The sentence fell like a stone thrown into a calm lake, creating ripples that spread throughout Clara's heart. She asked softly, "So, who is that person?" Caleb looked toward the window at the end of the hallway, his voice low enough to sound like he was talking to himself. "You should ask those closest to Jonas, because the person who knows him best also knows his weaknesses." Clara felt a chill run down her spine, not because Caleb was threatening, but because he had just planted a thought in her mind that she dared not face. Ethan was the closest person to her, but was Caleb really targeting him? Clara watched Caleb's figure walk down the hall, Each step he took seemed to leave an endless trail of doubt. She went into Jonas's room. He was still asleep, breathing deeply and slowly. Clara sat down and placed her hand on his. The warmth of Jonas's hand calmed her. She felt she had to be strong, not let unfounded suspicion take her away. Jonas needed her wisdom. This ranch needs you to calm down. She looked at him and whispered, "When he wakes up, we will find the answer together." And at that moment, Clara understood that what awaited them ahead was no longer just a matter of the past, but a fire that could burn down everything they were trying to hold on to. The room was so quiet that Clara could hear the heartbeat of Jonas's hand in hers. Each beat was like a signal from the dark depths he had just emerged from. She sat beside him, not moving a step, for her intuition told her that this sleep would not be just the sleep of a tired person, but the silence before real memories returned. Ethan's footsteps echoed in the hallway, deep and heavy, like someone struggling to keep himself from collapsing. Clara recognized them from a distance. The man carried a burden he did not share with anyone. She stood up and walked out, closing the door softly so as not to wake Jonas. Ethan stood at the end of the hallway, his hands on the wooden railing, looking out at the open space. He didn't turn when he heard Clara's footsteps. It was as if he knew she was coming, but didn't know how to face her. Clara approached, her voice soft but firm. "Ethan, what are you hiding from me?" He took a deep breath and replied, "I'm not hiding it. I just haven't said it yet, because I'm not sure what I think." Clara stood beside him, following his gaze. The land stretched out like a pale brown blanket, strangely quiet, but the silence only accentuated the unease spreading inside her. Ethan continued in a low voice, I know who Jonas met before he fell down the hill, but I still don't want to believe it." Clara turned her head to him, her eyes wide. "Who is it?" Ethan replied slowly. "I saw 2 horses tied near the entrance to the slope that day. One was Jonas's. The other, I think it was Tom's." Clara was silent for a few seconds. Each thought in her head was woven tightly together, like a fishing net being tightened bit by bit. Ethan continued, "I didn't dare say so. Tom had worked here all his life, more loyal to the ranch than anyone. But I knew the signs of horses. I'd cared for them since I was a kid. The second horse must have belonged to him." Clara looked down at her hands. She remembered Tom's strained expression, the duffel bag in the corner of the stable, the way he avoided her eyes when she asked him questions. But Clara still did not believe that the silent man could be a danger to Jonas. She spoke softly, as if struggling with herself. Maybe Tom was passing by. Maybe he was nearby, but not involved. Ethan pursed his lips, his eyes darkening. "I don't want to accuse anyone, but if Tom was there, and there was gunfire, then things couldn't be simpler." Clara placed her hands on the railing, trying to keep her voice calm. "Ethan?" Jonas heard someone yell, "Don't shoot." If Tom was there, it was unlikely he would have fired. Ethan nodded slightly. He didn't deny it, but his eyes still held undisguised pain. Clara continued, her voice soft but not weak. "The only thing we know for sure is that there were 2 people there, and the one who wanted Jonas down wasn't the one screaming." Ethan turned to her, his eyes filled with the weariness a man only showed when he was completely exhausted. "Clara, I fear this is suggesting something worse than suspicion of Tom," Clara asked softly. "Who are you thinking of?" Ethan was silent. Not because he didn't have an answer, but because he wasn't ready to say the name. Clara could sense that, but she also knew that forcing it would only make things worse. She put her hand on Ethan's arm. "When you're ready, tell me. Whoever it is, we'll find out." Ethan nodded, his eyes leaving the ground. He looked toward Jonas's door, drawn there by an invisible thread of duty and love. Clara returned to the sick room. She opened the door softly, just enough to step in. Jonas was still asleep, but his breathing was no longer steady. It was ragged, slow, as if his body were fighting something unconsciously. Clara sat down beside the bed. Jonas's hand jerked slightly, not from pain, but from the memory. She took his hand, feeling the slight movement. Jonas groaned softly, his eyebrows furrowing. Clara spoke close, her voice deep. "Jonas, it's okay. You're safe," he whispered in ragged breaths. "Someone standing behind me. The shadow is very close." Clara stopped breathing. Jonas continued, his voice drawing from the depths of his mind. "One stood far away, the other stood closer, and the one near me said, 'Jonas, listen to me.'" Jonas's head tilted slightly, his lips trembling slightly. "Clara," I recognized that voice. Clara choked. Why, Jonas opened his eyes. His gaze was not yet clear, but enough for fear to flare in them. He held Clara's hand tighter, helpless but pleading. I heard Tom's voice. Clara felt as if the ground beneath her feet had slipped. Jonas closed his eyes in exhaustion, but his hand still held hers tightly as if to make sure she was still there. Clara didn't know which feeling to believe first. She knew Jonas was remembering. He wasn't making it up. His story matched the other clues. But this memory tangled her like a tangled mess of half-burned wire. Jonas whispered, but the shooter wasn't him. Clara was silent. A breath of air seemed to return to her chest. A small hope, but still a hope. Jonas continued. "Tom yelled. I was sure. He yelled, 'Don't do it!'" Clara felt the two most important sentences had just opened a gap between them. If Tom had screamed, then who was the other person who was further away? Who fired the shot? Jonas was so tired he could barely keep his eyes open. Clara helped him lie more comfortably, stroking his tangled hair. He whispered one last time before falling asleep. "There is someone. I know." Clara put his hand down, her heart pounding. She left the room, her hands still shaking. Everything was coming together, pieces fitting together, but the last piece was still hidden. Someone at this ranch has something to do with it. Someone Jonas recognized. Someone is waiting for the opportunity to suppress the truth again. Clara stood silently in front of Jonas's room. Worry seeped into her chest like water seeping into the earth. The truth is coming out, and it's going to break something important. Clara stood in front of the door for a long moment, her hands gripping the wooden frame. She took deep breaths to steady herself. Jonas's words before falling asleep made her heart vibrate like a string stretched to its limit. Jonas remembered Tom's voice, but he was sure that Tom had not fired the shot. It made everything suddenly dim again, as if the flickering light had been half covered by someone's hand. Clara stepped out into the yard, the cool air carrying the familiar smell of hay. Every time the wind blew, she felt like she could hear unspoken words echoing through the old wooden walls of the ranch. There was no one on the porch, just the sound of horses' hooves in the silence. Ethan was in the stables. Clara saw him from a distance. He was bending down to check the lock on the stable door, but his movements were mechanical and labored. Clara walked closer, her shoes sinking into the soft dust under her feet. "Ethan, we need to talk." He raised his head, his eyes like someone carrying an unconcealable worry. "Is there something from Jonas?" Clara looked at him deeply, trying to keep her voice slow and steady. Jonas remembered he heard Tom's voice before he fell. Ethan dropped the brush to the floor, the sound light but strong enough to startle Clara. He stood still for a few seconds, as if deciding how to respond. Ethan asked slowly and low. Jonas said, "What exactly?" Clara replied. He heard Tom scream at him not to do it. Then someone else opened fire. Ethan closed his eyes, his shoulders slumped as if someone had just placed a rock on his back. "I know Tom didn't do it, but if he was there, he knew something." Clara hesitated. "Do you think Tom is hiding someone?" Ethan opened his eyes, his gaze sharper than ever. "Tom is loyal, but loyalty sometimes makes people do things they don't want to do." Clara felt her heart sink. If Jonas believed he recognized Tom's voice, he was certainly not mistaken. Ethan looked toward the cage, his voice catching on each word. "Clara, there's something I haven't told you. I don't want to upset Jonas, so I won't mention it." Clara was silent. Almost a month before the accident, Jonas and Tom had argued, not violently, but with a lot left unsaid. Jonas wanted to change the way the ranch was divided, Tom was worried it would offend someone else, Clara asked. Why Ethan looked at her, his expression falling like someone weighing between protecting and confronting. Caleb. Clara paused. Caleb had been ambiguous all along. One moment, friendly, the next, threatening. But this time, Clara heard something in Ethan's voice that reassured her he wasn't just making empty accusations. Ethan explained, Caleb and Jonas had an old agreement from their father's time. They each had a share in the land to the north, but Jonas wanted to change it because he thought the land belonged more to the ranch. This upset Caleb, though he didn't say so explicitly. Clara looked down at the ground, listening to every word. The fragments of memories, words, and actions of everyone suddenly began to connect with each other, like a network slowly appearing. Clara said lowly, Caleb was at the ranch more than necessary, and he always asked Jonas what he remembered. Ethan nodded slightly. I began to understand why he was worried. The two were silent for a moment before Clara spoke up. We have to find Tom. He knows better than anyone. Ethan agreed, but before he could leave, there was the sound of running footsteps from the other end of the yard. Tom appeared, breathing heavily, his face haggard. He stopped before Clara and Ethan, his eyes glazed over as if he had experienced something worse than fear. I don't know what to do anymore. Ethan took a step forward, his voice low. Tom, you know something? Tell me. Tom shook his hand over his face, like someone who has kept a secret for too long and finally can't bear it anymore. I didn't shoot. I would never dare hurt Jonas. But I was there. Clara stepped closer. He shouted, Don't do it! Jonas remembered it clearly. Tom nodded vigorously, tears welling up in his cloudy eyes. Yes, but it wasn't me who shot. I tried to stop him, but it all happened so fast. Clara shivered slightly. Who is that person? Tom choked, as if strangled by memories he didn't want to keep. Caleb. He was standing a distance away from Jonas. I saw him draw his gun when Jonas turned around. Ethan clenched his fists, his eyes darkening. Clara seemed to lose her balance for a moment, but Tom continued, his voice breaking. But I think Caleb wasn't trying to kill Jonas. He was just trying to warn him. Who would have thought Jonas would back off just in time? Ethan was stunned. That is worse than attempted murder. Clara spoke, her voice tight. Caleb didn't say anything about it to me when he came to the ranch. Tom looked at them both, as if begging for a forgiveness he didn't know he deserved. I regretted not saying so sooner. I was just afraid it would make things worse, afraid Jonas would know and be hurt. Clara stepped forward and placed her hand on Tom's shoulder. Tom, you were the one who shouted. Jonas remembered clearly. That proved you didn't mean to hurt him. Tom bowed his head, tears falling to the ground. Ethan, Jonas is my boss. I don't want him to suffer any more pain. Ethan put his hand on Tom's shoulder. The touch was light but heavy, like the torment of a lifetime. From now on, no more secrets. Clara looked toward home. An indescribable feeling rose in her heart, both relieved by the revelation of part of the truth, and heavier by the knowledge that the final storm was yet to come. If Caleb didn't mean to kill, but fired the gun, what made him do that? And why did he try to hide it all? Clara felt the air around the ranch change. Old secrets were torn away, revealing cracks that led to the ultimate truth, the truth that only Jonas, when fully awake, could tell. Clara sat next to Jonas, watching the light through the window fall on his face. The clarity returned to those deep gray eyes, but with it came the pain of someone who had just crossed the fragile line between life and memory. Torn to shreds, Jonas no longer looked as frightened as before. He was calmer, as if he knew it was time to face what had been hidden. Clara took his hand, her voice soft but firm. Jonas, do you remember anything else? He nodded slightly. His hand squeezed hers lightly, not out of concern, but as if to prepare her for what was about to happen. I remember. Caleb got there before Tom. He came toward me, his face tense as if he had just wrestled with something heavy in his heart. Clara listened to every word, her heart beating slowly and heavily. Jonas continued. Caleb told me I should stop fighting over the northern lands. He said the changes would be more disruptive than I could imagine. When I refused, he stepped back, drawing his gun. Clara held her breath. He didn't point the gun at me. He just raised it in a threatening manner. I guess he wanted to scare me into giving up. But everything turned into chaos when Tom appeared and shouted a warning. Jonas paused, swallowing slowly like someone struggling with the truth while remembering. I turned reflexively. That was when Caleb fired. I backed to the edge of the ground. And the rest you know. Clara felt a heavy air spread through the room. The truth was clear, but it also cut deeper than she expected. Jonas sighed. I believe Caleb didn't mean to kill me, but he chose the worst way to protect what he thought was his. Clara put her hand on his shoulder, her voice soft but not hiding her sorrow. He took things too far. Jonas closed his eyes slightly. It wasn't the fall that hurt me. It was the thought that I had ever considered Caleb family. Clara understood that feeling better than any words could comfort her. She knew the hurt of betrayal was more than just a physical wound. It was in the heart, deep down. Ethan appeared in the doorway. He didn't hurry, just stood there looking at Jonas, his eyes soft but sad. Clara turned, nodding slightly to reassure him. Ethan moved closer, sitting down beside the bed. Jonas looked at him. I know you guessed it, Ethan replied slowly. I wish I was wrong. Jonas breathed lightly, his expression somewhat tired but clearer than before. Caleb needed to hear it from me. I had to talk to him. Clara panicked. No, he might still... Jonas shook his head slightly. Not to confront, but to end. Otherwise, this thing will tear us all apart. Clara looked into his eyes. There was no longer the man broken by loss. There was Jonas, calm and steady, a man who carried within him a strength from the land, from years of solitude that had not worn him down. Ethan stood up. I'll call Caleb. Clara held his hand back. We don't know how he will react, Jonas replied. Caleb is not evil, just a man led by greed and fear at the wrong time. Clara sighed, but ultimately let Ethan go. A moment later, the sound of horse hooves echoed outside. The atmosphere in the room seemed to drop. Caleb entered, his eyes no longer confident, but heavy, like someone who had just carried a guilty memory. He stopped before Jonas, his hands clutching his wide-brimmed hat until his knuckles turned white. Jonas looked straight at him. No resentment, no blame, only a rare sincerity. Caleb, we need to talk. Caleb swallowed hard. His voice was hoarse. I didn't mean to kill you. Jonas, heaven knows. I didn't want to hurt you. Jonas nodded. I believe it. Caleb broke down in tears, his voice breaking. I just wanted to scare him, to make him give up on changing the deal. I was afraid of losing my part. I was afraid of losing my family's future. But when Tom appeared, I was startled. I fired on reflex. I never thought he would back down at that moment. Clara stood beside Jonas, watching them. It wasn't a confession. It was more like two men who had worked together, now facing each other like souls drained of strength by something that should never have happened. Jonas said slowly. That's over. But the consequences are hurting everyone. Caleb choked. What do you want me to do? Jonas looked at Clara, then at Ethan. His voice was low and full of determination. I want peace, but peace cannot exist if the truth is hidden. You must come clean to the community, not to be condemned, but to put things right. Caleb collapsed into his chair, like a man who knew he had no way out. I will, if it's the only way to make amends. Clara felt a slow relief spread through Jonas. The truth was no longer a haunting shadow. It had been brought into the light, even though the light still hurt. Ethan took Jonas's shoulder, gently but proudly. He chose the strongest way. Clara squeezed Jonas's hand, feeling the warmth from his palm pass to her, gentle as a small fire dispelling the darkness that had been covering the ranch all this time. Jonas looked at her, his eyes sparkling with something more than gratitude. Clara, if it weren't for you, I think I would have given up while my memories were still dark. Clara shook her head slightly. I just walk with you on the path you need a companion on. The real strength comes from you." Jonas smiled, not a wide, not a loud smile, but a smile so deep and genuine that Clara felt her heart soften. Caleb stepped outside, ready to face his part. Ethan followed to make sure everything was on track. The room was left with only Jonas and Clara. She sat down beside him, holding his hand in hers. Jonas said softly, "Clara, after all, do you believe in us?" Clara looked into those eyes that had seen both sadness and resilience, then let out a gentle smile. "I believe in beginning again. I believe in what one finds after overcoming the darkness. And I believe in you." Jonas closed his eyes for a few seconds, like someone letting his heart be at peace for the first time after a long struggle. Clara continued, "We don't have to rush. We both carry old wounds. But if there's any place to start over, it's this ranch." Jonas smiled, his voice low with promise. "Clara, I loved you before you came here, but now I understand that feeling more deeply than anything I've ever known." Clara did not take her eyes off him. "I know." The silence returned, but this time, the silence was gentle and warm, not as heavy as before. An old chapter had just closed. A new chapter had opened, not rushed, not full of wins and losses, just two people finding each other after very human, very real wounds. Outside, the wind carried the scent of old wood and earth. The ranch stood still, as if witnessing the rebirth of storm-torn souls. Clara placed her hand on the back of Jonas's hand, her voice low but deep as a prayer. "We will heal, little by little." Jonas nodded slightly, his eyes brighter than they had been in days. From here on, things will be different. The story of Jonas and Clara reminds us that, at any age, the human heart can be reborn again after seemingly insurmountable loss. Silence is sometimes frightening, but it can also be the way a patient soul heals itself, and love, when it comes at the right time, can bring out the strongest part of each person. We all reach moments when we have to choose between pain and hope. Looking back, it is not what we lost that makes us alive, but what we had the courage to hold on to. Thank you, especially our adult viewers, for taking the time to listen to a story filled with silence and inner strength. I hope this journey reminds you that you are worthy of tenderness, no matter your age. If you find the story meaningful, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Your companionship is the greatest motivation for us to continue telling stories that touch the heart.